Hello and welcome to the Grandfather's Cave. In this video we are going to take a look at some dungeon maps, and I'm going to tell you how you can get the most out of them and do my best to make it easier for you to make your own maps, or, well, make maps. When I first started playing role-playing games, I started with the Dungeons & Dragons red basic box, the one with the iconic red dragon on it. And in the Dungeon Master's rulebook, in the interior cover, there was a key to drawing dungeon maps. That has actually been my go-to whenever I have drawn dungeon maps ever since. If you don't already know this key, I suggest that you find it online so that you can learn it. Knowing this key will make reading maps and drawing your own maps much easier. When I draw maps, I follow this key with only a few exceptions. Often I find that the greatest impediment to drawing great maps is getting an idea, having the inspiration. Sometimes inspiration comes to me easy, and I have a very good idea what I think the layout of a dungeon should be, what monsters should inhabit it. But other times I am a bit stuck. In those occasions I think it's a very good idea to go out there and get some inspiration. If you don't already know it, I think you should visit Dyson Logo, a site where you get fantastic maps, all drawn in this old school style, and you will generally be able to find something that meets your needs. I myself like to draw my maps on paper, but if you prefer drawing your maps digitally and want to be able to use them with virtual tabletops, then you might be interested in Dungeon Scroll, which lets you draw maps on your computer in this old school role-playing game style. I will add links to Dyson Logos and Dungeon Scroll in the description of this video, as well as a site that allows you to make randomly generated maps. To start off, I want to show you some sketches of maps that I have made. I generally like to make my maps in pencil, but I will often retrace them with pen to make them easier to read and make them look better. First off, a warning. Some years ago I drew this map. I was pretty excited about having made a map with different levels of elevation and some geographical features that would allow for some tactical movement and some interesting combat. But then one of my players noticed that this looks like a penis. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So we had a lot of laughs that night, but just keep that in mind when you draw your maps. In general, giving your players tactical options and making interesting terrain for combats is a very good idea. It will make it much easier for both you and your players to create a sense of drama and make combat much more exciting. When drawing a map, it's very important that you settle on a scale. I draw maps on graph paper, and the scale is always 5 feet or 10 feet to the square. In general, being aware of the scale of your map is important so that you don't create situations where combat isn't going to be interesting, either because distance between the players and the monsters is way too big, or that the spaces that you've created for the combat are way too cramped. It doesn't allow the characters to move, let alone allows for tactical maneuvering. In this sketch, you see the entrance area to a temple, and beyond that there's a large temple hall. In this temple hall you can see that I've drawn some stairs leading up to an altar. I have drawn a couple of corpses that look like tiny skeletons. The interesting part about this map is that once the player characters are done examining the temple and looting it, they will want to head for the exit. And when they reach the exit, they found their escape blocked by some devious mercenaries. In this situation, the mercenaries are at a height advantage, but the player characters can overcome this either by trying to overwhelm one of the mercenaries on the flanks, or by withdrawing back into the temple and see if they can lure their opponents in, where they will have the height advantage. Sometimes I use maps that I have not created myself. This is either because I don't have the right idea for how I want a map to look and find inspiration somewhere else, or because I'm trying to run an adventure that has a pre-printed map. The following maps that I'm going to show you are either such pre-printed maps or maps of my own that I have drawn in pen in a notebook. My original maps were much messier, and I had much more expansive notes on the contents of the rooms. As you can see here, I have a map that I call Barkle's Redoubt. It is actually a one-to-one copy of Castle Mistermere. The difference here is that I have drawn in the features in the dungeon on the map. So when there are beds, chests, statuary, boxes, I have made an effort to draw them on the map so that I can easily see them. That way I minimize how much time I have to spend looking at my notes when I run the game. In this map I have drawn some chairs that are not shown on the original map, and chairs are actually one of those things that are not present in the map key that I introduced earlier. I have a couple of different ways of drawing chairs, but in this map I've just made small squares. The problem with that is that it can become difficult to see the difference between chairs and boxes, because boxes are also just small squares when I draw them. Barrels, on the other hand, are small circles. And if I have a square with a C in it, then it's probably a box with a zombie in it. That is at least what I did with my interpretation of this level of Castle Misdemeanor. As you can see, I also draw chests a bit differently than they are in the previous key. Instead of a rectangle with a C, I draw a rectangle and add curves to the sides to indicate the domed lid of a chest. Here we have the first basement level, or dungeon level, of Castle Misdemeanor. Here too, you can see that I have drawn chests with these curves on the sides. But you can also see that I've used squares or small rectangles in a way that is not totally consistent. Here, they represent chairs, and here, they represent sleeping mats. And these are just tables, but you can see that because they have a T on them. But a T without a square or a rectangle is actually a trap, so beware. And contrary to what you are shown in the key, when I draw a pit, I don't want to do the bottom dark, because then it makes it hard for me to write numbers or add other icons in the bottom of the pit. And here you see a door with a dot on it. That's actually a locked door. As you can see here, I like to do spider webs. Here you can see that I have added some hay or sleeping mats. And these are small fires. I use these for campfires. And while these are chairs, this is chairs as well. It's a bigger chair. It's a throne actually. And then there's this here. You might wonder what this is, because it looks a bit like a table, but it also looks like a chest. This of course is a chest with a trap on it. So while the key is very good for drawing maps, you also have to improvise sometimes when you want to do something different. If you know this original Castle Misdemeanor dungeon, you know that only the first 2 levels have been mapped. And as a GM, you have to do the second map yourself. As you can see, there are 3 stairs leading down from this level. Instead of having them all lead down to the same sub-basement, I did something different. I had this one, the westernmost stair, go into a catacomb with ossuary drawn like this. When they go in further, they see that there are 4 coffins. In these coffins, they find different corpses, and one of them is a decoy that is supposed to make them think that the evil wizard, Bargle, is dead and buried down here. But investigating further, they find a secret door and are presented with a couple of puzzles. The 2 stairs in the southern and eastern side of dungeon level 1, they lead down to a different area. One of these doors can be opened with a mask that they can find in the catacombs earlier, and the other door can be opened if they have solved the puzzle that was there. There are of course alternate ways of opening these doors, but the way I've done it here, I tie the 2 different sections of dungeon level 2 together, making them affect each other. In a previous video, I mentioned that labyrinths seldom work very well in dungeons. And while I have a labyrinth in this area of the dungeon, this actually worked out quite well, because when the characters reach either area 7 or area 9, they get a hint at how they should navigate the labyrinth. These are quite simple and not very hard to discern. When reaching area 7, a magic mouth appears, taunting them and saying, "You will never get it right." That of course means that they should go left. And if they do that, they will immediately reach the center of the labyrinth. In area 9, however, they encounter another magic mouth that says there's no hope left. Of course, this means that they should not go left. While the rest of the labyrinth doesn't seem very complicated, it is filled with teleporters and random encounters. And therefore the players will want to get to the center of the labyrinth in a hurry. When the players completed this dungeon, they were hungry for more dungeon exploration. I really went out of their way trying to find a secret passage that would allow them to go further. They even went further, asking if there were marks by this altar, expecting it to be able to be shoved aside. Originally the idea was that there were not, but they were so eager for it, so they said, "Yeah, actually, there are some scraping marks on the floor," and you find a secret trapdoor. Not having prepared for a 3rd dungeon level, I pulled out a flip mat. I made some small modifications to it, but used it mostly as it was. As you can see, this is my version of that map, and it looks very much like the original. Paizo has produced a lot of great quality flip mats, and while I sometimes use them in their entirety, as I've done here, I sometimes just use fragments of them. How I do that, I will show you later. This here is a map of a bandit camp. The scale here is 20 feet per square, and the reason for this is that it is an exterior area. There are watchtowers, there are tents, there are sheds, and therefore I naturally need more space. I have added a bit of color with colored pens, mostly because I think that it looks better with blue water, and I wanted the trees to have green leaves. These small circles indicate the tree trunk, and these other small circles, they indicate stumps of trees. And these small circles, they are a palisade. And these two are tables flanked by benches. And while these three are tents, this is a tent as well. This is not a tent. This is just a roof guard tower, as is this. And this is not a roof guard tower. This is just a roof building. And this is a tent where you can see that there are tables and benches inside. This is a shed with sleeping mats on the floor. This is a raised platform for archers. And this here is a smithy that has been carved into the cliffside. And as you can see, there are cliffs all over the place. And I indicate the elevation. If someone wants to scale that cliff, I know how tall it is. In this map area, I changed the scale because now we're indoors. But it's actually the same area as the previous map. As you can see here, I have drawn tables without the T and small chairs next to them. These are shelves and these are benches. It might be confusing for someone that hasn't drawn the map themselves. Something I think you should note here is that you can give your players the impression of a much larger place with a simple trick. Collapse rooms and corridors. That way the players get an idea that this place is actually much larger, but has been cut off by the collapse of this area. It rarely happens in my games, but if players want to remove rubble and debris in order to clear a corridor from collapse, I will allow them to do it. I will just tell them that it takes time and you need some tools to do it. And that usually buys me some time so that I can make a map for the area behind the collapse. In general, I am always able to distract the players long enough so that I can get a map for that area ready for the next gaming session. This here is also a map that I found online. It's something that is both a blessing and a curse with many of those maps is that they have not been filled in. That is bad because then you have to come up with ideas about what to stock the rooms with. But the good thing is that you have an empty space which you can decorate and populate as suits you. In this adventure, I drew the outside bandit camp, then I drew the first dungeon level, and then the second dungeon level. Then I was inspired online for the third dungeon level, and the fifth and the sixth dungeon levels were taken from flip mats. And when we get to the sixth dungeon level, it is once again a map that I drawn myself. So as you can see, even though I think it's fun to draw maps myself, sometimes I am forced to do something else, either because of time constraints or just because I can't come up with an idea of what the next dungeon level should look like. However, combining these different methods will often give you a great dungeon that both has a lot of your own original ideas and some of the great ideas that other map artists have made. This is another example of a map that I've made myself. This stair leads up to a roadside tavern filled with bandits, and it can be tricky to get past the bandits and into this cellar. Therefore, I have added a secondary entrance over here. And if players start investigating outside, they might actually be able to find this entrance instead. Whenever possible, you should try to add secondary and even tertiary entrances to a dungeon. That makes for a much more dynamic exploration, and is also something that will make for a more interesting gaming session for you as a GM, because you cannot predict how your players are going to tackle the dungeon you make. Aside from having secondary entrances, you should also give consideration to interconnect the different areas of your dungeon, just like I have done with this dungeon, where the players can move down this central corridor, or they might be able to find a secret entrance into this armory, or they might actually be able to find the secret tunnel that connects the Beastmaster's quarters with the secret exit. This method of adding secondary entrances or access points and interconnectedness in a dungeon is something that is called Jaquaysing a dungeon. It's a term that is labeled after General Jaquay. If you search Jaquaysing the dungeon, you're going to find a lot of good ideas and inspiration on how you can do this. This here is actually an example of how I used another flip mat. I copied part of the flip mat onto a piece of paper, and then I antiqued it and gave this as a handout to the players. When the players they got there, they realized that there were a lot of guards there and wanted to do something else. I had, of course, prepared a larger dungeon exploration than indicated on this small map. So I was ready for it when they said that they wanted to go into the sewer and see if they could find an alternate entrance there. And sure enough, I allowed them to do that. They made a convincing case for where they should find the sewer entrance, and I therefore allowed them to bypass that first part of the dungeon. This way they reached the deepest and perhaps the most dangerous part of the dungeon with all of their resources intact, and the players really had a feeling that they had beaten the dungeon on their own terms. This here is an entirely different type of dungeon map or adventure map. This sketch represents a small linear adventure where the player characters reach a small village to travel into a forest where they reach an intersection. They can go in one direction, reaching the home of a small fake creature that will give them hints to the plot that is unfolding, or they can instead go in a different direction, following the main road where they can either enter a large cave where a dragon lives. That might give them some more information. Or they might head straight for the Great Lake, where they will find the witch's hut at the top of a waterfall. This is a very basic, very simple, and quite linear adventure. But this example just shows that dungeons don't always have to be lines on square paper. Another example of that is this diagram. I've used it in an earlier video to explain how you can use a diagram like this to make a point crawl. When making a point crawl, you don't have to divide the different encounters into phases like I've done here. But I did this because time was an important aspect of this specific point crawl, and I wanted to ensure that the players kept moving forward. But if you remove these phases, you can use a diagram like this to connect different encounters, thereby creating a very open adventure structure. And as you can also see in this diagram, not all adventures need to have very precisely mapped out locations. For this adventure, any random or generic forest location would have done for these encounters. And this last area was a temple. You could actually use any temple location that you find interesting. What I want you to take away from this video is that if you learn a map key and stick with it, it's actually quite easy to make good-looking dungeons yourself. And it becomes very easy to navigate your maps just by looking at them, so that you don't have to write everything down as descriptions. The other thing I want you to take away is that there are a lot of sources of inspiration out there, and you should let yourself get inspired all the time. You can use those dungeons in their entirety, or you can use just fragments of them as suits you. I hope you have enjoyed this video and found it entertaining. And until next time, keep slaying.